Hi everyone, we have here with us Nicolás Pereda. He is the co-director of My Skin Luminous with Gabino Rodrigues. The film is in the international competition at Curtas. Nicholas, thank you so much and welcome. I'd like to start by asking if you could please describe your film a little bit and tell us how the subject of this film came about, how the idea for the film came about.
So this was a complicated film to make in some ways and in some other ways not, but it took up many years for some reason. Generally, I make films a bit faster, but from the time we shot it till the time we premiered, probably 2.5 years, almost 3 years passed, because the conception of the film was very different than the result of the film. And I decided together we decided with Gabino to co-direct something without knowing what we were going to co-direct. It was more, he's acted in a lot of my films. He's also a theater director himself. And we wanted to make some work together. We didn't know what. And I was reading a lot of novels and stories by this Peruvian-Mexican writer, Mario Bellatin, who I think is a quite interesting writer. And I was being inspired by some of ideas in his universe, and I wrote a screenplay, and I sent it back and forth with Gabino, and then when we went to shoot it, nothing that was really in the screenplay was working. It was like everything that we tried, it had to do with the acting and with the relationship with the children. I had worked with children before, but I realized that the children I'd worked with before, I knew them a lot longer and I'd spent a lot of time, so I was writing for them. Whereas these kids, I hardly knew. I had just met them kind of when we started shooting. So a lot of the things we were trying were not working. And so we had to reconfigure the entire thing. We had nothing that's, I mean, the second part with Mario Bellatin in that place, that was thought of beforehand. Because that was, I invited him to come but anyway, but we were balancing. Most of the building of the film had to do in post-production to figure out what stories could we keep, what stories could we impose. We wrote the whole story of the quarantine and the sick child and the sick white child in this, this indigenous child that turned white in the editing. So it was not, which is kind of the central sort of a story, or what maintains the structure of the whole film is that story, and that whole story was brought in later. And in a way, we were kind of trying to build little stories within a larger one, all in post-production. And some of the things that you see in the stories that, the children imagine stories and then we see them, some of those were for a different film that we were also trying to make at the same. We were trying to parallelly make two short films. And then we realized we only had one, and that maybe we had to take some things from the other film into this one. And so it was a very strange process that we've never had before, and that I've never experienced before. But it was enjoyable to see a film transform itself so much in editing, which it never happens to me. I mean, obviously things change in editing, but not to this degree. So that was kind of nice.
And can you speak a little bit about the collaboration with Gabino, with the co-directing, and how it affected the outcome of the film? If it was different than something that you have made it by yourself? Because the other day I was talking also with a director who shared his directing with another person, and he was telling me that the main difference for him was when he was working with someone else, he overanalyzed everything. He had any choice that he made, he had to find a reason and was always trying to make it logical. So in the end, they always had everything was super analyzed. Everything was very rational. Did you find the same, or was your experience different?
It's funny you mention it, because my experience is almost the opposite. Because the problem I have, I'll have to contextualize a bit, because Gabino acts in a lot of my films, and he's a director himself as well. And in theater, and when he acts in my films, he is constantly giving me ideas and advice. So it's not like it was like a new idea to be co-director. It was more like some of the other films, perhaps he's almost a co-director, to a certain degree. I mean, not because he's a little bit more on the sidelines, but when he's there, he's very present as an actor, and he suggests scenes. He doesn't only suggest creative things. He also says like, oh, now we need to eat, and we stop the shooting, and then we go, so he's also like very sort of present in the other films. And so it was normal collaborating. But the difference is that when I'm alone, it's directing, you have a dialogue with yourself. Mm-hmm. And so you trust your instincts, but at the same time, you doubt yourself somehow. You don't have this constant approval of yourself. There's something inside you telling you maybe this is not so great. But the problem with Gabino is that I think we've grown artistically together. We met when we were like 21, 22 years old. We made a film right away when he started making plays, a few years before we met, but basically most of our artistic careers were knowing each other. We trust each other too much, perhaps. And so whatever he says, I agree with. I'm like, yeah, that's amazing. Automatically, not because of the idea, but because it's coming from him. And whatever I say, his first instinct is to say, yes, this is great. And so it's almost like it's like like many mothers that think like their child's painting is amazing always, even if it's like terrible. We are like that with each other a little bit, that we automatically think that but the idea of the other is great. And so that's at the opposite danger, that we don't need to even think about it, because if it comes from the other person, we think like, great, this is amazing. So that was a strange thing, but it was interesting while we were shooting, like in more concrete sense, is that I was thinking about how this whole thing was going to come together, because I was worried about things. And then I was sticking to some original ideas that I had written down. But then in the film, we use a ton of things that he came up with that are a bit more performative. And I think it comes from his sort of more experimental theater background. Like there are some scenes where all the children are inside with their eyes covered like this, mm-hmm. or with their eyes closed. And it was kind of a strange thing to do because we didn't know what that was for. And he would be like, okay, he would just tell me, okay, just put the camera around here and shoot these people. So I was doing the camera and he was doing sound. That was the other nice thing, is that we didn't have a crew. It was just the two of us. And sometimes my wife, who's a filmmaker, helped us out a little bit as well. But so I would frame and she would start telling the kids, okay, everybody turn your, close your eyes. And I would look at him like, what is this about? He's like, whatever, And then he would be like, okay, open your mouths, put your, like weird things that we didn't use, but all kinds of, and then there is this exercise of following the steps of the person behind you very slowly, which is those kind of exercises that theater people do. And so he was coming up with weird things that it was unclear why we were doing them, but he seemed to think that it didn't matter. We had time. Let's, experiment. I was thinking a little bit more in terms of the, let's say, documentary side. Sort of, I was shooting and caring about creating moments of like every day in the school and them eating, and so I thought that was important. And he couldn't care less about those things. He was like always about the performativity and the fiction and the. So it was kind of nice. I'm interested in those ideas and I work with those ideas of performativity, but I'm a lot more subtle in my other films. I feel like it comes in a more subtle way, the performance aspect. And here is a little bit more heavy, but I think it comes from his sort of input of fiction of the body, of like movements that are not natural, of things like that.
Yeah, but you would agree with any idea that he had, so he would end up doing these things. But I think the result is interesting because you can see a little bit of your documentary style, and then with the everyday stuff like you were saying. But there's also this almost mystical movement or performance, especially with the part of the writer Mario Bellatin and his scenes. So that was interesting. But Can you speak a little bit about those everyday scenes that you're trying to capture in the school? Because the passage of time seems to be a central theme in this film and also in your works. Even though here we have a narration, there is no sense of a timeline, and it's like we are watching a state of suspension in those places. Are these aspects important for your work? Something that you try to depict this passage of time in the state of suspension?
Yes, I mean, the way I think about cinema in general has a lot more to do with the present of each moment than the connectivity of the different moments. So it's not so much about the causal relations between moments, but I'm interested in the moment in and of itself. So it's not important. It becomes important, the accumulation of this moment and the editing later, but I'm interested in the fact that if we're gonna see someone eat, the eating is important in and of itself. It's not about what will happen next because of the eating or what happened before and that led to that. It has to do with observing that moment and that moment being important. Of course, it doesn't always work, and sometimes it feels more banal than I meant it to be. But I do try to think about these moments as essential to these people's lives and therefore to the films. Like, it's not the life in the school is not an excuse to talk about something else. The life in the school is important in and of itself. And so time is essential because in a way I cannot shorten the time, because then I reduce the experience to its information. And what its interest is not the information of the experience, but the feeling of the experience. And to feel an experience, you have to kind of engage with the time. And so all the films are the basis of the editing and also in the shooting. And when you say action and when you say cut and then when you edit, has to do with a strange balance of how much time is enough to connect to the actual time in real experience. Because obviously it's not a one-to-one situation, right? Like something that happens in life in half an hour, it's not a half an hour shot. It's not like Warhol, but it's more like maybe it's 3 minutes, but 3 minutes on cinema is a lot of time as well, depending on if the action is very much. Anyway, so this balance of how time because time is a subject in many ways, because time is where the experience happens. And so it is a big question during shooting and during editing, how much time we're going to experience with each action.
There's some scenes with longer takes, especially when you are doing the depiction of everyday situations. Where do you find the balance of the length of those shots? Is it more when you are editing, or when you are shooting, you're already thinking about it, or it's something more instinct?
This must happen to all filmmakers. And when I'm shooting, I find what I'm looking at so great, which is a strange. I mean, even if later I realize it's not, that I want to watch it for a long period of time and I want to continue. And because I always have time, there is no rush, I shoot for shots that are probably way longer than necessary. But it's not because I'm trying to protect myself and then have enough footage or anything like that. It has more to do with this kind of feeling immersed in what I'm watching, and feeling kind of or sometimes that feeling like any moment a surprise will happen in the shot. And so I'm not surprised, but there's something there, and I'm hoping, there's this hope that something will kind of connect, and then once that happens, then give it breathe time as well. And then in editing is I have to leave the material for a while, and then when I come back, be a little bit more. But it happens all the time. I mean, it's a constant process, both in editing and during the shooting.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about your process of working with these non-professional actors, like the children especially? And how much do they contribute, or if they have any input to the filmmaking, outside of being the subjects, if they have any input or if they change the way that the story is being told in the moment?
It varies from person to person, of course. And both the directing of them and also and their input changes. And also in some films is drastic, how much they change things, and some not. So in this particular film, because the things I had written were not really working, and we were all the time kind of rethinking. We were also listening to stories of the kids and talking to them. And so some of the stories that they tell, we used and transformed a little bit. But they were not actively, we didn't know each other that well, and they were not actively proposing scenes. But I mean, for example, the teacher, because one of the actresses is the teacher in that school, she did propose things that then became very central. So not so much, even though she doesn't appear that much. Like one day she said, the first day she said, listen, for this to be a bit more normal, why don't I just teach a normal class, and you move the camera around however you want, but I'll teach a class and I'll give them a subject about whatever I want. And why don't they later go into groups and they, like what they would do. And then later they do a presentation and then you film the something like what she would do in her classroom. So we said, great, let's do this. So she decided to talk about water and about these different stages of water. And then they go into groups and then they do the presentation, which is the beginning of the film, when they're very kind of tight and they don't know each other that well and they're having a hard time. And so that was all us, because we shot this in the summer. And so the school was not active at the time. So we kind of created the whole scenario. And so it was not like we came into a classroom that was operating, but we had to, generate all the content. And so, for example, her presence was important for her to conduct a classroom in a normal manner. And she also was able to communicate with the kids. And it's fictional in some way, but she's doing the things that she always does. And when the kids are presenting, they're presenting for real. I mean, they're trying to, and they're really nervous, really. And so in that way, it was not in the screenplay. I had never thought of doing a presentation. And then this ideas of water, which she just came up with because it was something easy to explain to kids of different ages, became later something that is very important in the film. And somehow connects, the rain later and the woman swimming and the rain and the fountain and the rain in this, all these different elements that are linked to water are kind of start in that scene at the beginning, which we'd never thought about. They're not talking about water because we wanted it, it's because the teacher. So there are connections, and also. Yeah, I mean, and there's a few other stories that came up from them, but it was not like the kids would be like, okay, we came up with this idea and we're gonna do this scene and things like that. So it's each film was a bit different, but there is a lot of influence from the people around, especially in this film that things were not working, so we had to be coming up with a lot of ideas in the moment.
And one of the central ideas of the film is the story of this kid who happens to get sick, and then there's this idea of exclusion and contagion and isolation, quarantine, and it feels like there's a connection to the situation that we are living in now. So it feels like it was some kind of vision that you had, and now it's becoming current and actual. How do you look back at that, and do you see that? Do you think?
No, I mean, it's funny actually because it's my son who was just crossing behind here. That's the boy that is in the film. But there is something funny, because in the film, there is the sense of quarantine is the sense of total detachment and total kind of, the level of isolation is almost mystical. And there is kind of a transformation of the entire world because of this sickness, in the sense of, the school, the first part of the film is so everyday-like and everything, and the lighting is very flat and very kind of, everything seems undramatic. except the sickness is the dramatic, and the sickness is what brings us to the second part, and where the dramatism kind of explodes. But the experience of this pandemic is so underwhelming, and so it's so horrible in some ways, but it's so it's like, okay, yeah, I'm home and nothing happens. And it's not this kind of idea of this apocalypse of the movies, or it's not sort of this mystical. It's very, okay, so now we're doing these things on Skype or Zoom or whatever instead of live, but it's not so it's a funny thing. But yeah, I mean, it's a different thing, but this idea of things transforming themselves radically is very kind of in the world of fantasy, because in a way the world is transformed, but the experience seems so, at least for many of us, is not it's not like this apocalyptic experience. It's just kind of shitty, but it's not dramatic. I don't know.
Yeah. So finally, I'd just like to ask you, you have a long relation with Curtas Wildkund. This is your fourth film that is being screened here, and you received an award in 2014 for El Palacio. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of film festivals like Curtas, especially when they have programs dedicated to short films and to find new talent, and also a little bit about your story with Wildkund?
For me, to be able to build this kind of relationship with festivals is amazing, and Curtas in particular is interesting because of the programming, because it's not says to me, I don't know that much about short film festivals in some ways, because even though I make several shorts, they always end up screening mostly in feature in like normal larger festivals, and I don't have much relationship with short film festivals. Curtas must be one of the only ones actually that I've come back, and I find that the programming is incredibly. The reason why I find this incredibly strong, the programming in Curtas, is because there don't seem to be the kinds of films where you can see that the filmmaker is doing something so that later they can make a bigger film. It's not this kind of a only early career, before I make my first larger film, I'm making 3 shorts and then I'll make my next big thing. But it's full of shorts by people that have made big features, or people that only do shorts, like or mostly, like for the longest time, like Ben Rivers, or those people that made a lot of short films, or Gabriela Branches, or people like that are making their career is based on their shorts, basically, or so those films tend to be more interesting because they don't feel like small features packed into smaller time because of money or because they're testing ideas. Anyway, I find that Curtas is a strange festival in that sense to me. I don't know enough, but it seems kind of the programming has always been pretty surprising and pretty amazing, and I've never been able to go, unfortunately, but I follow, I look at the programming and I find the films elsewhere, and I find this is pretty interesting. And of course, for this type of films, I mean, because I always go back to make smaller, shorter works. I mean, this film was supposed to be long, to tell you the truth. It's short because in the editing, we cut, and then that's what it is. So the reason I make shorts is not because I make sometimes shorts or sometimes features, is more because I make a film, and sometimes it's, when we finish, we look at the time, it's okay, it's 30 minutes or 40 minutes, so that's it. So when I finish a film and then I look at how long it is, and it's less than, 60 minutes or something, then I'm like, oh, fuck, now who's going to show this? It's very difficult. So places like this are amazing because it gives breathing room. It keeps also because it's not an event that it just happens isolated and nobody finds out, but it has a little bit of weight, and other people are looking at the programming, and you get invited to other places thanks to this type of events. And so the only way these films can live is through festivals like this. So it's very strange lengths. It's not also the perfect 15-minute film, it's also strange lengths are many places are impossible. So anyway, so it's quite important for me.
Thank you for your words, Nicolas. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for your film, and take care.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.